Boldwood presents Wolf 6, written by Alex Shaw and read by Simon Mattox. Chapter 1. Chicago. The interior of the bank was a grand marble affair, as befitted one of the oldest banking establishments in the United States. Prosperity Bank had been created to oversee the banking needs of the brave settlers who'd pushed across the continental United States from east to west. In addition to current accounts, the bank managed savings accounts and held a vast number of safety deposit boxes. Now, in the 21st century, the needs of its customers and the way in which most of them conducted their banking had changed, yet there remained some who, for whatever reasons, preferred to hold on to their rented metal boxes. This is what had brought Ruslan Akulov to this branch of Prosperity Bank today. The two boxes were leased in the name of Noah Steers, an alias for which Akulov had a genuine US passport he'd had to present to confirm his identity. Each of his rented boxes contained another passport and $50,000 escape money. It wasn't a huge sum, but it was cash that was readily available if he needed to change identity or leave the country. Akulov wanted to empty both to give himself options. He always needed options if he was going to remain free and stay alive. Susan Pellat, the same bank official he'd dealt with before, led him down the hallway and towards what he remembered as being an overly ornate vault anteroom. Although she was the client-facing visage of the bank, after greeting him and hearing his request to access his boxes, Pellat had made no effort to engage him in conversation, which he appreciated. Being served by the same bank official twice was one time too many for a man in his profession, but they wouldn't meet again. It was time to leave Chicago. Akulov had perfected the art of being the grey man. He never wore outlandish or gaudy clothes, never allowed himself to get drunk in public, and certainly never started conversations or fights with anyone when he didn't need to. In fact, leading the life of an introvert suited him, and would have left him content if it were not for the constant borderline level of tactical readiness he had to maintain. In short, anyone from his past could come for him at any time. But first, they had to find him, and second, they had to take him unaware. And Akulov was always aware. As Pellat's heels clicked on the marble, Akulov noticed the security camera covering this section of the passageway was misaligned and incorrectly facing the opposite wall, seemingly having been moved to not record footage of anyone passing. Perhaps this was a malfunction or an errant cleaner with a duster. It benefited him. He preferred not to be seen. They reached the vault anteroom. Pellat opened the heavy security door and bid him to enter. The room led on to two vaults. The one on the right held cash, while the other was home to the deposit boxes. Pellat removed each box in turn from its wall and placed them on a large, chest-height, baize-covered table in the anteroom. She took a key from her pocket and placed it in the appropriate lock, and waited for Akulov to do the same with his. Pellat then gave a curt nod and turned her key, an action Akulov copied. Withdrawing her key, she moved to the next box and repeated the action with the second key. Once both boxes were unlocked, Pellat delivered a well-practiced sentence to explain what he needed to do when finished, and left the room. The heavy door shut, sending metal bars into the wall cavity on the other side. Akulov shuddered. It was the only time he allowed himself to be locked in anywhere. He let out a long, calming breath. He was here for his passports, two of them, in fact, and neither of them of his own nationality. Under his neat beard, a melancholy smile creased his face. He'd never had an external passport in the nationality of his birth. At the age of 3, and after the accident which had claimed the lives of his parents, Akulov had been taken to Moscow to live with his paternal grandmother. He had been brought up as a Russian and even joined its once grand army. But now, more than ever before, his adopted country sickened him. His paternal grandmother was a Russian-speaking Ukrainian from Odessa, and his father had been too. His mother, however, was from Kyiv. Akulov was a Ukrainian who, like countless others, neither spoke the national language fluently nor had ever really lived in his own country. But he was Ukrainian. He vowed his next long-term passport, perhaps even his retirement passport, would be both Ukrainian and genuine. He opened his first box. This one held a Canadian passport, bearing his true likeness in the name of Gary Lacroix. Slipped inside the travel document for protection, and in a white envelope, was a photograph. He took it out to study it again in the secure safety of the institution's anteroom. It had arrived 7 months before, delivered to a bank in Switzerland in an envelope addressed to his broker, using one of her business aliases. On a note inside was his name, and she'd had no idea who had sent it or why. She had hand-delivered it to him the last time they had met, the time he'd told her he wanted out, the time she'd laughed at his plan to fade away into retirement. His broker had taken the opportunity to have the photograph examined by an expert, who both confirmed its age, early 80s, and the fact that the image, including the 80s paper it had been printed on, had not been manipulated in any manner. On the reverse of the photographic paper, in Russian, in a clear hand, the sentence, "Everyone needs a home," had been written in blue ink. The photograph was a faded colour image of a group of people standing in front of a Soviet-style dacha. There were 4 adults in the photograph. 3 were smiling, and one, who had a serious expression on his face, was holding a toddler in his arms. One of the adults, Akulov knew, it was his paternal grandmother. The 2 other adults who were smiling he recognised, not from fully formed memories, but from photographs. They were his parents. The last adult, the man with the serious face who was wearing what looked like a bandage over the right side of his head, he had no knowledge of. This was the man who was cradling him. Akulov spent another few moments willing his brain to recall anything about his mother and father, but, as had always been the case, he was rewarded with mere glimpses of smiling, yet blurry faces. His eyelids fluttered, and he swallowed. Akulov's links to his past were intangible. He owned nothing which had belonged to his grandmother nor his parents. The photograph was the only link he had to a lost life. He replaced the photograph inside its envelope and once more slipped it inside the Canadian passport. Next to the passport was an envelope of cash, and under that was a second, larger envelope. That this one was padded and contained a watch. He affixed the Rolex onto his left wrist. The hands were not sweeping, but he knew it worked. It had no sentimental value to Akulov. It had belonged to an Italian thug who had attempted to kill him, yet it did have a financial value. Akulov knew that this specific example would pocket him a further $15,000 all day long at either a jewellery store or a pawn shop. If cash was king, the Rolex was a jack. It was always good to have options. Akulov turned his attention to the second box. This one contained cash like the first, but also a US passport in the name of Zane Newton. Both passports had been expensive because they were genuine and bore his photograph. They had been purchased from a highly skilled craftsman in Washington who'd been introduced to him by his broker. Akulov zipped the passports into the inside pocket of his jacket and then placed the envelopes of cash in the snug pockets of his jeans. Not the best solution, but better than carrying a bag, which reduced his mobility and speed. Using his keys, he locked the boxes and pressed a button to call Pelat back, who was waiting on the other side of the soundproof security door. Akulov heard the bars withdraw, and then the heavy door slowly opened. She gave him a simple nod as the door closed behind her. Together they once more locked the boxes and replaced them in the storage slots before opening the security door for the pair of them to leave. Pelat stepped to one side to allow him to pass. Akulov nodded back. There was no point in wasting words. He exited the room and waited for Pelat to escort him along the long hallway and back towards the banking floor. He noted again the sole misaligned security camera covering the wall and wondered how long it had been facing the wrong way. It was clumsy security, but now his boxes were empty, he wasn't overly concerned. Pelat was a tall woman and almost matched him step for step as they continued along the corridor, the clicking of her heels far louder than the footfall of his running shoes. Rounding a corner, he abruptly stopped half a pace behind a pillar. Pelat walked into him, for which she mumbled an embarrassed apology. Akulov spoke, his tone even, the words clear and the volume low. "Go back into the hallway. If there is a rear exit, get through that right away." She made some sort of reply, not comprehending, but Akulov's full attention was now on the tableau of terror he saw ahead. On the floor of the banking hall, customers lay face down with their hands laced across the backs of their heads. Hovering above them and making jerky movements with short assault rifles, Akulov counted 8 masked men. Akulov remained stony still. It was movement that attracted attention primarily, not noise. Behind him, Pelat, now seeing the panorama, gasped and bolted back the way they'd come, her heels clattering on the old, cold marble floor. Akulov swiftly stepped backwards around the corner and into cover. The gunman must have entered the bank whilst both he and Pelat had been in the vault anteroom. Courses of action flitted through his mind, and none of them were favourable. He should turn tail and run. This wasn't his problem. The customers were nothing to him. An angry command was yelled out in a language Akulov knew, Russian, to find whoever was running away. Akulov had to move immediately. He was directly between the gunman and Pelat, and right between the gunman and the vault. He started to run and realised that he'd never reach the rear of the bank before his pursuers. Sounds from behind now reached his ears of men moving, booted feet striking the marble floor. They'd see him soon. They couldn't fail to. He increased his pace and tried to open a door to his left. It gave a fraction of an inch and then stopped. Whoever was inside had wedged it shut. He tried the next door. There was a small window by the side of it through which he could see the occupant, who was on a landline and gesticulating wildly with his free hand. Akulov had no choice. He opened the door and entered the office. The man on the phone all but fainted with shock. He dropped the phone and his hands flew skywards. His mouth moved rapidly before he managed to make any words form. It was fear. Akulov had seen it innumerable times before. It was dangerous. It created panic. Panic caused death, and Akulov had no wish to die today. "Please, please don't hurt me," the man blurted. Akulov shut the door, saw there was a key in the lock and turned it. "Get under the desk and do not speak." "Please." "I am a customer," Akulov said, as he moved into the cramped, concealed space with the petrified bank official. Outside the door they could hear boots hurrying past. The bank official said, which Akulov thought was obvious, "They're going for the vault." Akulov didn't reply. The words didn't warrant an answer. The boots came to a halt, and then the door shuddered as the handle was jerked up and down. "What's in there?" The voice was rough, the language English but the accent Russian. "The loans manager, Webster," a second voice replied, the accent local, Chicago, and the tone matter-of-fact. "Why is it locked?" "Be a lunch," the Chicago voice again replied. "He has lunch every day at noon, and he shuts up when he's out." "Any cash in his office?" a third voice asked, also with a Russian accent. "Nah, just papers, loan agreements." "I hate paperwork," the first Russian said, "but I love paper money." The men moved away from the door. Akulov inspected the cowering man next to him. "Are you Webster?" The man bobbed his head. "I'm late for lunch." Akulov's mind continued to compute. He'd counted 8 men in the banking hall, although there may have been more unseen behind pillars or in other rooms, and certainly one at least would be outside on the street. 3 men had just passed. 2 were Russian, and from what he knew of Russians, they didn't like working with anyone who wasn't one of their own. So who was the third man? He sounded far too calm to be a hostage. Webster was thinking too, because he said, "That was our senior security guard. I recognized his voice." Akulov now understood. It was an inside job, which meant the team would be in and out. They knew exactly what they wanted and where it was, which also meant that he could stay put and stay safe, in theory. But then, why were the men with Russian accents asking what was in the office? Had their aims changed, or had their personnel? Before Akulov had any more time to mull this over, a scream pierced the quiet, followed by an angry yell, and then the unmistakable sound of gunshots. Automatic, 9mm, if he was being precise. Feet slapped the floor outside the door. More male voices shouted in Russian. The words were indistinct apart from the loudest, which told Akulov all he needed to know. "You killed the hostage!" There was a roared retort in Russian as insults were yelled at one of the team by another, and then more petrified screams and gunfire. "They're shooting!" Webster's voice was high and tight. "Yes," Akulov said. "They are." "Oh, my God! Oh, my God!" "Be quiet," Akulov hissed. You do not want them to come back here." No, I do not." Webster clamped his hand over his mouth. Footsteps passed by the door, but the pace was different, slower, shuffling. It was as though their owner was either injured or carrying something heavy. Apart from this, there was silence, which meant either all the hostages were dead, or no one was shooting anymore, or both. "How many exits does this building have?" Webster looked at Akulov but remained silent. Akulov waited, then said, "You can answer me quietly." 3. No, 4. Yes, 4. Akulov thought back to half an hour before when he'd entered the building. "The lobby has 3. Where's the other one? Out the back?" "It's a fire exit. A pair of reinforced double doors." "Okay." It was a standard layout. Akulov wondered if the gunmen had all exits covered, especially if they were hitting the vault. So did that mean a team of more than 8? Webster grabbed for his landline, which had fallen onto the floor. He put the receiver to his ear. I don't understand. It worked earlier, but now the line is out. It's a panic line, connecting to the Chicago PD. I was trying to explain to them what was happening when you appeared, but there's no dial tone now." "It has been cut, or jammed," Akulov stated, as much to himself as to the quivering man beside him. "Who had access to the line?" "Just security, myself, and my boss." "What is the response time?" 8 minutes. "Not sooner?" "Traffic." Akulov needed to move. He had no other option. "I'm going to go out there. You stay here, lock and barricade the door behind me, and keep quiet. Do you understand?" "Yes." Akulov rose from under the desk and on his haunches edged towards the door, all but soundless on the corporate grey man-made carpet. He could still hear the argument coming from the main lobby, interspersed with whimpers of, he imagined, customers and staff. The safest course of action would be to stay put, ride out the raid, and wait for the intruders to leave. But then the police would arrive, and so would the questions, and before he knew it, he'd be swept up, identified, and hauled off by a no-name agency. Akulov was a man with a past, but he also wanted to be one with a future, and that meant that he had to act in the present. He had no choice. He had to leave now. He slowly turned the key, relieved that it was a mechanism that was well used, and giving off the faintest of clunks, it retracted. He paused, listened, and reassured that no one was waiting for him on the other side, turned the handle in a sharp, sudden movement. He listened again, heard nothing new nearby, and then pulled the door inwards an inch. There were no approaching footsteps or shouted alarms. Akulov pushed the door open further. A faint yet familiar scent scratched at his nostrils and clawed at his throat, making him want to sneeze and cough, but forcing him to focus even more. The gunpowder had drifted from the banking hall, circulated, he imagined, by the powerful AC that all American corporate institutions seemed to rely on. Letting himself go prone, Akulov led with his head, inclining it until he was able to poke just the top into the opening. The hallway back towards the banking hall was empty. He let his eyes wander upwards, where they landed on the security camera nestled in a corner, and now its incorrect positioning made sense. The bank's security team were the insiders. So why the shouting? What had changed? The Russians had killed someone now. That was what had happened. Akulov rose to his haunches and in one darting motion shot a glance around the blind side of the door, the side that faced the vault. Empty. He got to his feet, silently stepped out into the hall, then pulled the door shut. A moment later he heard Webster moving to lock it, the sounds amplified in his ears. He had a choice to make. Turn right towards the banking hall and the front of the bank, a route he knew was blocked by an unknown number of gunmen, or turn left and head for the exit past the vaults. The vaults, where the cash and deposit boxes were stored, were the prize the Russians were after, yet he imagined they would be less well defended than the front, where men were needed for crowd control. Akulov turned left, walking fluidly yet rapidly down the hallway to the blind corner, which would take him to the vaults, and then past this to the rear exit. His running shoes were all but silent on the tiles, a testament not to their manufacture, but to the way he'd been trained to walk. He lengthened his strides to minimize contact with the floor and to give him the option of sudden acceleration if needed. Ever aware that at any moment he could be discovered by someone heading in either direction, all his senses were on alert. The hallway seemed to elongate in front of him, and his stride slow, as though he was walking through waves on a deserted shoreline. It took him the briefest fraction of a second, perhaps a thousandth, perhaps even less, to react as a figure appeared from around the corner. His eyes told his brain the man was a danger, and his brain ordered his legs to move. Akulov's legs doubled, then tripled their speed, and he tore towards the gunman. The man had an assault rifle slung across his chest and was weighted down by a large and laden black kit bag held in each hand. Like a competitor in a strongman contest attempting the farmer's walk, he was waddling forwards. That made him unable to defend himself, and that was good for Akulov. Launching himself from his back foot, Akulov's right knee struck the bagman squarely in the chest, just below the assault rifle, knocking him backwards. The man fell, still holding the bags, his head slamming onto the tiled floor. Momentum carrying him forwards, Akulov came to rest on top of him. The gunman had thick facial features, a heavy brow, a nose all but flattened from what looked like years of boxing, and small black eyes, which were now closing as he lost consciousness. Akulov took no chance that he would come round and slammed his right elbow into the centre of the ugly face, hearing cartilage crunch and envisaging bone shards puncturing the brain and causing death. Akulov rolled off and cast wild glances each way, confirming they were alone, before he wrestled the assault rifle away from the motionless man. He nodded in appreciation. It was an expensive weapon, an HK 416. As he started to advance towards the turn, there was a sudden yet suppressed boom, and the wall shook. C4 charges. The assault team were using plastic explosives to blast their way into what? The safe? No, he reasoned. They already had access to that. What they didn't have were both sets of keys to the several hundred deposit boxes lining the walls of the strongroom. But, he reasoned, using plastic to blow open Minnie's strongboxes was overkill. Too much, and the contents were incinerated. It was difficult to judge how much was needed. So that meant they were trying to open as many as they could as quickly as possible, rather than targeting specific boxes with a drill. For an inside job, it seemed as though their intel on the bank's clients and what they may or may not hold was lacking. Akulov continued, reaching the corner. He'd spun around, weapon up. Two more men were roughly moving bulging holdalls, one standing outside the door to the anteroom and the other dragging his loot across the threshold. They both looked up. The one in the hall instinctively reached for his own HK, which was propped up against the opposite wall, whilst the one in the doorway remained immobile. Akulov fired a 3-round burst at doorway man, hitting him in the chest before he had time to retreat, and then a second burst at the second man before he could bring his weapon to bear. Things had gone noisy. He'd had no choice, and now he had no reason for stealth. Akulov jogged towards the two men as he heard shouts from inside the anteroom. More men, more threats, and they were alert. Pointing the HK into the room, he saw two more men who'd been packing bags. A woman was sitting on the floor. Susan Pellet. There was a vivid welt on her cheek. Having more time to respond, one of the pair had hoisted his HK. He fired at Akulov. Rounds snapped past, tugging at Akulov's clothes, hitting the wall behind but missing him, or so he thought. Akulov returned fire, slamming the man backwards and over the top of the bags he'd been in the process of packing. The other man grabbed Pellet and pushed her towards the door, blocking Akulov's line of sight. Screaming, she stumbled forward, barely able to keep her balance on leaden legs. Akulov dropped to a knee and sent a burst past her to the left as she fell to the right. But the Russian was less careful, and his snatched shots sliced into her. On full automatic mode, his remaining rounds went high. Akulov's next shots caught him in the face and throat. Akulov entered the anteroom for the second time that day. Both gunmen were dead, and a puddle of dark red blood had seeped from beneath Pellet. As he neared, her eyes fluttered open. Akulov had seen enough gunshot wounds to know there was nothing he could do. "I am sorry," he said, the words carrying meaning, but sounding as hollow as the chamber they'd both stood in less than half an hour before. Susan Pellet's face would now haunt him in his dark dreams, added to the slideshow of those he'd failed to save. Her eyes closed and he turned away. Akulov cared little for how many men with guns he'd ended over the course of his career as a soldier and then as one of the world's most dangerous assassins, but he had a code, a set of rules. Number one was he never targeted non-combatants. Akulov became abruptly aware of a fiery sensation rising in his side. He realized he'd been hit, and a sudden dizziness threatened to overwhelm him. He looked down. Blood, his blood, had dripped onto the tiles by his feet. His adrenaline had been masking the pain. There was nothing he could do about it until he was free. He had to push the pain away. He was still standing and still breathing, which told him it wasn't life-threatening, at least not for the moment. Hearing dulled by the cacophony of gunfire in the enclosed killing floor, Akulov almost didn't hear the Russian threats shouted at him from along the hallway. The Russians knew he was there, but they didn't know who he was, and more importantly, what he was and what he could do. He wasn't going to go out like this, caught like a rat in a trap, especially if it meant losing to Russians. As more seemingly distant Russian reached his ears, Akulov felt his side with his left hand. It came away red and wet. Rage now powered him, propelled him forward. Akulov knew there were men in the hallway with guns. He didn't know how many, but he knew if they were anything like those he'd encountered so far, they would not hesitate to cut him down, especially now they'd seen he'd already taken out several members of their crew. Casting his eyes around the room, he saw only the rifles of the dead men and no further weapons or magazines. His one gun against however many men were waiting for him was not good odds, even for a former member of Russia's most deniable special operations unit, the Werewolves. Then a thought struck him. Akulov hustled into the safety deposit room and saw several connected and primed lumps of C4 that lay on the table waiting to be affixed against the steel strongboxes. He took the detonator from the tabletop and moved back towards the external door. He could sense that just beyond the threshold, angry, armed men waited, and they were growing impatient. Summoning all his strength, Akulov hurled the net of interconnected C4 charges around the door and out of the anteroom before spinning back inside and flattening his back against the wall. He depressed the switch on the detonator, and an all but simultaneous explosion ripped through the hallway. Without giving either the dust or the smoke any time to settle, Akulov stepped out into the thick of it, weapon up and seeking out targets. 3 gunmen this time. 2 lying on the ground and 1 further away on his knees. He stepped over the 2 nearest, who'd been eviscerated by the blast, and shot the 3rd gunman in the head. Akulov's magazine was almost empty, so he dropped the HK and collected the gunman's. It was bad practice to rely on a weapon he hadn't fired, but he had no choice. He decided he needed to see the hostages go free. He advanced back towards the banking floor. He encountered no one else in the hallway and took the last corner wide and low. Instantly, he made out another gunman, half hidden behind a desk. Akulov fired, ripping the man's head apart and destroying the flat-screen monitor by his side. Gunshots rang out, a handgun this time, firing from the far end of the room, by the same door Akulov had used to enter the bank. His movements jerky, as though gripped by panic, the shooter hastily exited backwards out and onto the street. Akulov knew what a runner looked like. The shooter was saving himself. Another gunman stood up amongst the hostages, like the only tree left standing in a forest decimated by fire. He dropped his HK and threw his hands up. "I surrender!" The accent, a Chicago twang. Akulov recognized it as belonging to the head of security, the man who was, in part, responsible for the death of Susan Pellat. Akulov cut him down with a 3-round burst, then dropped his HK. On rubbery legs, he reached the nearest doorway. Turning, he paused and looked around the banking hall. Customers, bank officials, and a UPS courier lay cowering, whimpering on the ground. "It is over! Get out! Get out now!" He waited until the bodies on the floor started to sit up, move, and then, as they began to realize Akulov was telling the truth, stampede for the exits. Akulov joined them, letting himself be carried out of the bank and onto the Chicago street as the sirens of the Metro PD reached his ears. Chapter 2. Crofton, Maryland. There were no photographs of her husband displayed anywhere in the house on Shaftesbury Avenue. She would always love Tom, but could not live with the constant reminders that he was dead. After the funeral, she had redecorated her home, which now would never know the children it had been bought with the expectation of providing love for. Its bedrooms would not see gaudy nameplates on the outside and colourful bedding within. The house had become an empty show home, its new furniture tastefully arranged to entice buyers. Devoid of her memories, it was ready to absorb those of its new owners. None of her memories lingered here, except for Tom's Porsche. It sat shrouded in its own mausoleum. Something had prevented her from selling it, even after she'd stopped sitting in the passenger seat, drinking their favourite Drumshanbo gin and talking to her dead husband. But now she'd given up drinking, and she hadn't pulled back the classic car's red crest-embossed cover for months, let alone opened the door. Yet she could not sell the silver Porsche. It was all she had of him. "Mandy, are you sure you want to do this?" "I do." Her eyes flicked away from the window in the two-car garage beyond to her visitor, Tom's best friend and former colleague before he'd left the FBI for the CIA, Greg Lindenbauer. He sat across the newly bought anonymous IKEA dining table, his gaze locked on her. Two identical brown letter-sized envelopes lay between them. One Greg had brought with him in exchange for the contents of hers. She let her fingers strum its rough outside as the silence in the lifeless room lengthened. Greg let out a long breath. "I'm going to ask you just one more time. Please, let it go." "No." "Tom was killed in the line of duty, you know that." "Give me the name, Greg. Give me the name of the man who killed my husband." "Mandy, neither you nor I are with the FBI anymore. What good will you knowing his name do? You can't investigate him by yourself." "You do not get to tell me what I can or cannot do, Greg. Give me his name." "If I do, you'll give me the footage and delete the original?" "You have my word." "In all the years I've known you, Mandy Murphy, even when the three of us were with the feds, I'd never thought you capable of blackmail." She tapped her envelope. It contained the evidence of Greg's affair she had compiled using her covert surveillance knowledge and hacking skills. "I don't want to hurt your wife. Give me the name, Greg, or we're done here, and she finds out about you." Lindenbauer seemed to deflate, and he said, "His name is Pedro Blanco." Mandy's eyelids fluttered as she searched for a match in her mental database. "You'd better have more than his name in that envelope." "I do. It's to show you that anything you're planning is pointless." "Pointless?" Her eyes narrowed. "Can I have my envelope now, please, Mandy?" Mandy pushed her envelope towards him with her right hand as he mimicked the movement with his own. They momentarily touched in no man's land before their recipients took control. Tom quickly opened his envelope, eyes widening at the 10x8s inside. "You know, I could have you arrested for hacking into a local government network, copying the footage and making these stills." "Would you like to explain to your wife why you were entering a motel on a Tuesday lunchtime with a waitress?" Surprise shot across Lindenbauer's face. It was a micro-expression, but she noted it. "You know she's a waitress?" "I know everything about her, even her favorite sexual position. You forget, this is what I do." She corrected herself. "Did." Murphy turned her attention to the contents of the envelope she'd been given. It was a CIA file on a Cuban national by the name of Pedro Blanco. She speed-read what was visible of the text before dropping it back onto the table. "Now, do you understand, Mandy, just how hopeless going after this guy really is? The U.S. Marshals have him wrapped up tighter than the Pope's pecker. There's no way you can bring him to justice." "I know, Greg, I understand that. But what I want is to take justice to him." "What do you mean?" Murphy crossed her arms. "I want him dead, like Tom, and I want you to help me do it." Lindenbauer was quiet for several seconds before he managed to rasp, "You want me to kill Pedro Blanco?" "No. I want you to give me the name of someone I can pay to kill Pedro Blanco. I need the contact details of a professional assassin." Luxury Lounge, Chicago. The table in the private room of the club was long to enable the full 12 members of the Bratva Council to be seated. The chamber was dark, just a central chandelier illuminated the space, and heavy blood-red velvet drapes prevented any natural light from entering through the windows. The two most senior men were already seated at either end of the table. The remaining 10 would be summoned when their presence was required. The club was owned by the Bratva and used to mix income from their legitimate business interests with those of their traditional endeavours. This was Joseph Korzhev's lair, and Devyat, his second-in-command and most trusted counsel, could plainly see the man from Moscow was angry. As Devyat looked on from the other end of the table, the head of the regional Bratva poured himself a shot of vodka from the sweating bottle directly in front of him. He picked up the glass and violently threw its contents into the back of his mouth. Only now did he speak. "Viktor is dead." Devyat knew Korzhev cared little for his sister's son, but nevertheless said, "I am sorry for your loss." "Spasiba." Korzhev made a show of refilling his glass and pointing it at the heavens before he emptied it again. He continued, "I have surveillance footage from the interior of the bank. It shows our men being attacked, but not the how or the who. The why, of course, we know. We are the top dogs." "This came into your possession from our source in the Chicago Police Department?" Devyat asked. "It did. Our inside man at the bank was so incompetent he did not take care of all his security cameras. Our tame police detective has subsequently erased the footage." "Good. Good? No. Very bad. This attack is a declaration of war." Devyat's face showed neither surprise nor anger. As a former member of Russian military intelligence, the GRU, he knew how to control both his emotions and the way his face displayed them, which was something the man he advised did not. He said, "How is that? They, whoever they are, have murdered Viktor and almost his entire team. They have made us a laughingstock." "May I see the footage, Joseph?" "Da." Korzhev raised the remote. Devyat turned his seat as a pair of panels parted at the far end of the room and a huge flat-screen TV flickered into life. An image played of 3 men entering a hallway from behind an open door. One, with a bag in each hand, started to waddle towards the camera. "That is the bank," Korzhev stated, "and that is Viktor." Viktor grew larger in the footage as he drew nearer the camera until he walked past it and out of shot. Both men remained silent as the footage continued to play and showed the 2 remaining men straining to haul bags out from behind the door. Another man now entered from the bottom of the screen. He had his back to the camera and had an assault rifle. It was held up and ready. The 2 bagmen saw him. One grabbed at his own rifle, but neither of them had a chance to defend themselves as the newcomer opened fire. Devyat watched the 2 Russians fall and then the man disappear behind the door. Without another camera angle or any audio, he was unable to see or hear what was happening in the room connected to the vault. After a minute, 3 more Russians arrived in the hallway, weapons up, facing the open door. They checked their dead comrades. Seconds later, an object sailed around the door and exploded. The footage shook as the shock wave rocked the camera and smoke filled the hallway. Through this, the unknown man reappeared, firing. Korzhev paused the footage as the camera showed an image of the unknown man's face. Devyat felt his chest tighten and the blood suddenly rush in his ears. It couldn't be, could it? Was it him? Yet the way he had moved and defeated the team suggested it was. Devyat cleared his throat. "What do we know of this man?" "Absolutely nothing. This is your area of expertise. What can you tell me about him?" "The man is a highly trained professional, and he is fearless. There are not many who could move and react in that manner." Devyat's eyes narrowed as they again focused on the screen. "In fact, I believe he is possibly one of the highest-trained individuals there is." "What are you saying, Devyat?" Korzhev refilled his glass and knocked back the vodka once more. The older man looked away from the image and met Korzhev's black, soulless eyes. "I know his type. Perhaps even his unit. We need to find out who he is and who he is working for, and then we need to find him. And when we do, we kill him. What else can we do? Nothing, Deviat replied. We cannot let an attack on the Bratva go unpunished. Agreed. Kozhev gave a simple nod. Call the others in. Deviat rose to his feet and strode towards the door. On the outside he remained even, like a becalmed sea. Inside, however, a storm had started to form. He unlocked the heavy soundproof door and, opening it inwards, passed Kozhev's command on to the soldier on sentry duty. He returned to his seat, noting that Kozhev had already hidden the TV screen, and moments later watched the 10 other members of the Bratva Council enter the room, each nodding first at Kozhev and then at himself before they sat. Deviat observed Kozhev, whose gaze travelled to each of the men around the table before coming to rest upon the youngest man present. Kozhev spoke, the volume of his words barely above a whisper. How many of your men are dead, Dmitri? All of them, Dmitri Timofeyev replied, his voice faltering. Including my sister's kid, Viktor? Da. Suka, Kozhev swore in Russian. How? It was the Cubans. They were waiting for us. They? Yes. That was very unfortunate for your men. It is also highly unfortunate for you, because you are lying to me. Timofeyev visibly recoiled. Please, Joseph Yevgenyevich, they took us by surprise. They? The Bratva boss refilled his glass and swallowed another shot. Visibly composed once more, he said, I shall ask you again. Who attacked you? Timofeyev's eyes darted down and then up at the other faces around the table, Kozhev's lieutenants and most trusted associates. A man. Who? A customer. I shall play the tape, Kozhev said, and raised the remote for the new audience to view the footage. Tape? What tape? Timofeyev's voice was almost a whine. One you were unaware was being recorded, Deviat said. Once again at the far end of the room the panels parted and the huge flat-screen TV came to life, and then the footage played. That is the bank, Kozhev stated once again, and that is Viktor. Da, he was moving the cash. The assembled Russians watched the footage as Deviat watched them. Once more, Kozhev paused the footage as the camera showed an image of the unknown man's face. This was just a customer? Kozhev asked. Da. Timofeyev swallowed. Who else could he have been? So, you are just telling me that he was a Boy Scout in the right place at the right time? Kozhev said, making no effort to hide his sarcasm. Da, нет, I don't know. Kozhev slowly placed the TV remote back on the tabletop as he digested the new information. In letting this operation of yours go ahead, Dmitri, I was giving you the opportunity to, as the Americans say, step up. I let you choose your team, and you assured me that because you had people on the inside, it would be a simple in and out that would garner us an extra $6 million whilst squarely putting the blame on the Cubans. How did your operation fail so catastrophically? I don't know. Think. The Cubans must have found out. That man posing as a customer must have been one of them. Shut up. I do not believe this has anything to do with the Cubans. Kozhev poured another drink. They do not have the ability to learn of our operations, and they certainly do not have anyone with this level of ability. This man is a professional. This man is fearless. Is that not so, Deviat? Yes, Deviat replied. It is. Exactly. This man is a real professional. Whilst you, Dmitri, I do not know what you are. You only continue to breathe because of a binding agreement I made to your father. Yet if he were alive, he would disown you for being a fool. This is your mess, and you must clean it up. Find this man who has killed my nephew and bring him to me. Otherwise, I will be forced to break my promise. Safe House, Chicago. Akulov was only in pain if he moved, and even that was mitigated by the morphine. The doctor he had seen, a man trusted in his field of work, had cleaned the wound, repaired the damaged muscles, and stitched him up. He was lucky the injury had been a through and through. The round had entered his body, missing all his internal organs before punching through and out the other side. It hadn't hurt at the time, as adrenaline had dulled the pain, but as this had started to ebb away, it had hurt like nothing on earth. Yet it had been the blood loss that had almost been the end of him. Now he was recovering and out of any danger in the medical sense of the word. He was, however, in danger of a different kind, and just as deadly. Akulov had left DNA in the form of blood and fingerprints at the bank, and, he realised, potential CCTV footage of his face from the other cameras. As his mind replayed the events of the afternoon 2 weeks before in his head over and over, he recalled at least one CCTV camera pointing in the right direction. But had the system been active? It had been an inside job after all, so surely it had been switched off. Akulov reasoned his beard, if indeed his face had been captured, would have somewhat confused any potential recognition software. Or maybe not. It was his blood and fingerprints that would be the slam dunk. He had no doubt that he was on the radar of the local police, FBI, and several other agencies he'd battled before. But there was no use in fretting about something he could not change. As soon as he was healed up enough, he'd alter his appearance and move on. Canada was the obvious choice, and probably one of the safest, but the men manning the borders would have his details. Unless he swam across, which was always an option, although problematic, especially with his still healing injury. Or he could get lost again in the United States, perhaps in another big city, or maybe somewhere remote. Either way, he had 2 legends to burn through, and enough cash to last him a while, and of course access to his secure, numbered online accounts. Akulov rose from the bed and, wincing, wobbled to the window. It was his favourite time of the day, pre-dawn, a time when everything and anything was possible. He watched the sky, a slightly lighter shade of midnight blue than the water of Lake Michigan, which it seemed to rise out of. He preferred the real coast, but had to admit that lakeside wasn't at all bad, and the water was probably a whole lot cleaner than the ocean. Akulov leant against the window frame, his torso throbbing and stitches still tight as he watched the sunrise. It was a new day, and he hoped it was one in which he could make a new start. He retrieved a burner smartphone from the dressing table and reassembled it, putting back both the SIM card and the battery. He waited for it to latch onto the Airbnb's Wi-Fi and then logged into his secure email, one where he only ever received one-sentence commands. He had a single message. It came from a Proton Mail account with a randomized name. The message was a single word: talk. Akulov put the phone back down and picked up a bottle of pills. He took a couple of the horse-sized antibiotics, washing them down with a slug of flat coke from the can he'd started the night before. This was all delaying actions, he knew. He picked up the phone, walked to the solitary armchair and sat. He opened up another Proton Mail account, one with a nonsense name, and looked in the drafts folder. There was an unsent message from his handler. I have an urgent request for your services. This one you will want to take. Akulov deleted the draft and composed his own pointed reply. Why? He logged out of the account and disassembled the smartphone. As one of her top-earning assets, Akulov's decision to step away from the business had not been met with any degree of happiness or understanding by Valentina Tishina. The hard fact was, he had realised, killing for a living was easy, but living for a reason was much harder. And it was time for Akulov to stop taking the easy way out and confront the ghosts of his past to make amends to those he had wronged. He sighed. He'd wait for Tishina's reply.